Well, the pivot was a good idea. We should have done the pivot. We didn't do the pivot. The problem with the pivot, and this is not a critique of people like Kirk Campbell who were pushing it, because the political situation probably didn't allow it at the time. I think it was too vague, and it wasn't sufficiently focused on China as the main threat. So it was kind of this kind of vague Asia is the future stuff, and there wasn't like a military planning thing. There were attempts within the Pentagon through like the Air Sea Battle Initiative to give it more concreteness, but they didn't succeed for reasons that are not the fault of the people who are pushing it at all. But what we need to do is, I think actually we know what we need to do, and actually this part of the discussion I think is kind of over, which is that the U.S. Department of Defense says that we need a denial defense effectively for the pacing scenario, which is Taiwan. The Australian Ministry of Defense official position is that they are adopting a strategy of denial. Japan uses a similar terminology. And Taiwan is moving in the direction of this asymmetric defense. So, which is basically about defeating the invasion. It uses, if you can defeat the invasion of Taiwan, by definition, you can essentially defeat the invasion of the Philippines or Japan. South Korea is a little different, but we can go into that if we want. But I think that basically would solve our problem. So I don't, at the sort of macro defense strategy level, I think this is, the 2018 National Defense Strategy and the 2022 National Defense Strategy, from what I can tell, are quite basically indistinguishable, but they're very, very similar on this point. So, what does that mean in terms of disposition of forces? It doesn't mean like throwing all your forces on Okinawa, because Okinawa is tremendously vulnerable to Chinese attack. What it means is that our forces are ready, properly positioned, etc., to be able to blunt a Chinese attack on Taiwan. This was the term we used in 2018. The blunt layer. The blunt layer is not actually physically necessarily right there, because it may use standoff munitions. A B-2 operating from the continental United States is more relevant to a Taiwan defense than a ship in Papua New Guinea that can't get to the fight and can't survive, even though it's closer, right? Now, I do think there is a strong role for forward deployed or rotational, whatever the right move is. And that's why I think actually the U.S. Army Pacific and the Marines force design are very valuable, because it's really difficult to, when people say that a Taiwan fight or one of these fights would not be a ground fight, that's ludicrous, because we have to assume the Chinese would get ashore. Of course, ground forces can also reach out and touch aircraft and ships that are approaching Taiwan or in the future. What Andrew Krepinevich has called the archipelagic defense model is, I think, very, very sound. And if you look at the difficulty that our troops had, our Marines had in getting Japanese forces out of Iwo Jima and Okinawa and Tarawa and Saipan and Peleliu, etc., that's a great problem to be able to pose to potential PLA power projection. So that's, I think, what the model looks like. And then I tend to be very agnostic in exactly what that looks like. That can be submarines, it can be advanced bombers. The problem with relying on those capabilities is they're very expensive. They take a long time to build. There tend to be few of them. They have to be in the right place. They have to be maintained. It's sort of a mix. That's where like the Marines and the Army can come in if they're properly positioned. They have the right weapons like NASAMS or HIMARS, and I guess they were using ATACMS in Balakatan the other day. I can't remember, maybe it was a PRISM, an early version of PRISM, which is encouraging. These kinds of capabilities, and others are much more expert on that than I. But, and then new technology is great. I am skeptical of betting the farm on new technology, which is a little bit of a concern for me. So something like the department's replicator initiative is great, but I don't think it's prudent for us to count on a sort of fundamental offset, if you will, of the PLA for a number of reasons. One is we don't know they'll work. Like, nobody's really tried to put these all together and operate them effectively in an incredibly contested and lethal environment. Also, the Chinese are pretty good at like not just drones, but electronic warfare, jamming, cyber capabilities, etc. So I think we need a multi-layered defense. I laid this out in a proceedings article last year, layered both geographically, but also in kind of ways, if you will.